I was standing in the probate attorney's office when the old woman handed me a leather envelope that would destroy everything I thought I knew about my family. The document inside was written in 1947, a contract so ancient and in such a strange dialect that 3 lawyers had already given up trying to read it. Then a homeless black boy, no more than 15, glanced at it from across the waiting room and said, "That's Creek Nation script. I can read it." By the time he finished translating those 3 pages, my entire inheritance had evaporated, my uncle's reputation was in ruins, and I understood why my grandmother had taken the secret to her grave. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where the real story begins, not with the document, but with the life I thought was solid as granite. My name is Jennifer Hartwell, and until 6 months ago, I was living what most people would call a blessed existence. The kind of life that appears in the photos you post on social media, but rarely mention in conversations. The kind where everything looks perfect from a distance, but has its own particular brand of chaos underneath. My husband Michael was a senior partner at Morrison & Associates, a real estate law firm that handled most of the high-value commercial deals in Oklahoma City. We lived in a 6-bedroom colonial in Edmond, the kind of neighborhood where the HOA was meticulous about everything from mailbox colors to the height of your grass. Our 2 kids, Emma and Jake, went to the private school that cost more per semester than most people's monthly mortgage. My volunteer work at the hospital kept me busy 3 days a week, and I served on the board of the city's Children's Literacy Foundation. We took vacations to Vail in the winter and rented a beach house in Destin every summer. My mother-in-law, Linda, had opinions about all of this, particularly my decorating choices, but mostly she stayed in her assisted living facility in Tulsa, where we visited every other Sunday with practiced smiles and carefully neutral conversations. The morning my grandmother's will was supposed to be read, everything appeared normal. Michael had already left for the office by 6, kissing me on the forehead the way he did every morning, his mind already 3 deals ahead. I made Emma's lunch while she complained about her algebra homework, and Jake asked if he could skip soccer practice to work on his robotics project. The kitchen smelled like the expensive Keurig coffee we bought from that place on Broadway, and sunlight streamed through the plantation shutters in that particular way that made me feel, for a split second, that life was exactly as it should be. I remember thinking, as I dropped the kids at school, that turning 40 next month felt less like a milestone and more like an arrival point, a place where you could finally say you'd made it. My father had called the night before. His voice had that careful quality it took on whenever he had to discuss family business, the tone he used when he was managing everyone's expectations and his own anxiety simultaneously. "Jennifer, the reading is at 2 o'clock. Downtown, Kersey and Lawson office on the 16th floor. Just you and Uncle Robert for now. Your sister's still overseas, so we'll do a formal reading with everyone next month." My father, David, was a retired engineer who had never quite fit into the world of inherited money and family drama. He preferred the company of his workshop and his woodworking projects to the complicated dance of family wealth management. That should have been my first clue that something was wrong. He wouldn't ask me to come alone unless it mattered. I wore a dark gray dress and the pearls my grandmother had given me for my 30th birthday. It was what you wore to probate offices, what you wore to acknowledge that someone important had left a hole in the world and you were trying to be respectful about filling it. The drive downtown took 20 minutes. October in Oklahoma City is golden, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's glowing from within, the trees just starting to turn, the air cool enough that you could breathe normally again after the brutal summer heat. I remember thinking that my grandmother would have loved this weather. She had spent her last 5 years in a memory care facility, gradually disappearing into a fog of dementia. But sometimes on afternoons like this one, she would have moments of perfect clarity where she'd sit in the garden and remember things with such vivid detail that you'd believe time hadn't touched her at all. The probate attorney's name was David Kersey. He was a tall man in his 60s, the kind of lawyer who had developed that particular expression of professional sympathy that comes from delivering both good news and bad news with equal frequency. He had been my grandmother's attorney for 37 years. His office smelled like leather and old paper and something citrus-based that was probably meant to seem sophisticated, but instead made me think of fake lemons. My Uncle Robert was already there, sitting in one of the leather chairs across from Kersey's desk, looking uncomfortable in the way that men in their 70s often look when they're wearing dress clothes on a Tuesday afternoon. Robert had always been the quiet one in the family, a widower for nearly 2 decades, who lived alone in Tulsa and spent most of his time volunteering at the Historical Society and complaining about property taxes. "Jennifer, come in," Kersey said, gesturing to the chair next to Robert. "I've asked you both here because there are some matters in your grandmother's estate that require immediate attention and discretion." She was very specific about this in her final instructions. He pulled out a leather folder and then, slowly, carefully, as if he were handling something that might break, he opened it and showed us what was inside. The envelope was cream-colored, old enough that the edges had yellowed to the color of weak tea. The handwriting on the front was my grandmother's, the careful, precise script she had maintained even as her mind began to slip. It said simply, "To be opened only by Jennifer, Robert, and my attorney, in private, before the reading of the will." Kersey slid it across the desk toward us, and I remember the envelope making a soft whisper as it moved across the polished wood. That small sound seemed to carry weight it shouldn't have carried. "Your grandmother came to see me 3 weeks before she passed," Kersey said quietly. She was lucid that day, very lucid. She told me that she had discovered something in her personal papers, something that had been hidden for 73 years. She said that if she died before she could resolve it, I was to show it to you three, and only you three, and that you would need to decide what to do with it. She said... He paused, and I watched him choose his words with the care of someone who knew that words had consequences. She said it would change your understanding of the family. She said it would be difficult, but she said it was the truth, and the truth had a right to exist. I felt something shift in my chest, that small, cold movement that happens when your body knows something before your mind catches up. Robert shifted in his chair, and I heard him clear his throat, a nervous sound, the kind that suggests the beginning of bad news. Kersey opened the envelope and carefully withdrew 3 pages of aged paper. The writing was not in English, not in any language I recognized. It was dense, flowing script in dark ink, with occasional notations and marks that meant nothing to me. The paper was brittle with age, the kind of fragile that makes you afraid to breathe on it too hard. He looked at both of us and said, "Neither Robert nor I have been able to identify the language. Your grandmother refused to tell me what it said. She said it was yours to discover. But she was very clear that it was important, that it changed things. And that's when I felt the weight of what was about to happen, not yet knowing what it was, but knowing with absolute certainty that my life, as I understood it, was about to crack open like an old egg, revealing something that might be rotten at the core, or might be something else entirely. The problem was, I had no way of knowing which, and no way of preparing for either possibility. The boy's name was Marcus. He couldn't have been more than 15, with worn sneakers held together by duct tape and a hoodie so threadbare you could see the thermal underneath. He was sitting in the waiting room because his caseworker had brought him in to meet with a social services attorney about his placement situation. That's what the receptionist had told me when I asked, her voice dropping into that particular tone reserved for kids who didn't have anyone to pick them up after school. But Marcus could read Creek Nation script from 1947 like it was yesterday's newspaper. After he translated those 3 pages, his voice steady and careful, pronouncing the older dialect with a precision that made the attorneys lean forward in their chairs, everything shifted. The document was a contract between my grandmother's father, William Hartwell, and a Creek Nation family named Swimmer. Not a simple business agreement, a debt. 73 years old, compounded with interest my family had never paid, written in a language my family had deliberately forgotten to keep the truth buried. My grandmother had discovered it among her father's papers, and had spent 73 years deciding whether to do the right thing or protect her family's name. In the end, she'd done something worse than either option. She'd done nothing. And now the choice had landed on me. I left Kersey's office in a state that could charitably be called shock. Robert followed me to the parking garage, his face gone the color of old newspaper. "Jennifer, we need to be careful about who we tell. This could destroy..." I didn't let him finish. I got in my car, locked the doors, and sat there for 30 minutes before I could remember how to make my hands work the ignition. By the time I got home, Michael was already there. His car in the driveway, the front door open, music playing in the kitchen. This was unusual. He rarely made it home before 7. The house smelled like the garlic bread from the Italian place downtown, the one we ordered when something was being celebrated, I found him in the kitchen, setting the table with cloth napkins. "Happy early birthday, love," he said, kissing the back of my neck. "I thought we'd do something special. The kids are at Mom's. I arranged for them to stay overnight. Just us." I looked at him, at the man I'd been married to for 16 years, the father of my children, the person I'd trusted with every version of myself I'd ever been. And I realized that before I could deal with the document, before I could even think about what it meant, I needed to know something else. I needed to know if Michael knew, if he'd known all along. "We need to talk," I said. The words came out flat, mechanical, like I was reading them from a script. "About the will, about something my grandmother found." His hand stilled on the napkin. The smile didn't leave his face, but something behind it went away. That was when I knew. That was the moment I saw it. The careful blankness of someone preparing a story. "What did she find?" he asked, but his voice had changed. It had become the voice he used in depositions, the careful, measured tone that meant he was calculating distances and angles. "A contract, from 1947, a debt." I watched his shoulders drop slightly. He turned away from the table and walked to the window, his back to me. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. "How much?" Not, "What does it say?" Not, "That's impossible," but, "How much?" The question of someone who already knew there was a debt and had only ever wondered about its size. "I don't know yet. The document is in Creek Nation language. A boy, a homeless boy from the waiting room, he translated it." I was watching his back, watching for the moment he would turn around and explain, the moment this would become a misunderstanding instead of a betrayal. "Michael, did you know about this?" He stood at the window for so long that I thought he might not answer. The neighborhood looked peaceful beyond the glass. Manicured lawns, houses with lights coming on as evening settled in, the world continuing its normal rotation, like my life wasn't collapsing in real time. "My mother knew," he finally said. "She told me years ago. Before we got married, actually. I wanted to tell you, but she said it was handled. She said your grandmother had made a deal with the Swimmer family, that they'd agreed to keep it quiet in exchange for some settlement. Small money. Enough to make them agree to silence." The room tilted. "She told you before we got married?" "I wanted to tell you," he repeated, and now there was something desperate in his voice. "But Linda said, she was very clear that this was family business, that it wasn't my place to tell you, that your grandmother had handled it and bringing it up would only cause problems." "Your mother told you to lie to me about a 73-year-old debt against my family?" "She said it was handled," he said again, and I heard in those 4 words every moment he'd chosen her certainty over my right to know the truth about my own life. "Jennifer, I swear to God, I thought it was resolved. I wouldn't have married you if I thought—" "If you thought what? That I deserved to know something about my own inheritance? About my own family's obligations?" He turned around, and his face was the face of a man who'd been caught in a calculation he'd thought was foolproof. "I didn't know your grandmother never actually paid them. I thought the deal was done. Linda was so certain." I sank into one of the kitchen chairs. The cloth napkins were still on the table, perfectly folded. The garlic bread was cooling in its basket. The candles he'd lit before I arrived were still burning, 2 small flames that seemed suddenly obscene in their cheerfulness. "I need to see the documents," I said. "Everything Linda ever told you about this. Every conversation, every email, every record of any payment your mother ever made to the Swimmer family." "Jennifer. Now Michael." He went to his study without another word. I sat in the kitchen, not moving, not eating, just watching those candles burn. My hands were shaking, but not the way they'd shaken when I first saw the old contract. This was a different kind of shaking. The kind that comes from understanding that someone you've built your life around has been making decisions about your life behind your back, and had been comfortable with that arrangement for 16 years. Michael returned with a folder. Inside were 6 emails, going back to 2008, the year before we got married. Linda's voice came through in every line, imperious, certain, dismissive of anything that didn't fit her version of how the world should work. The first email was to Michael. "The Swimmer matter is settled. Your fiancé's family has honored the agreement. Do not mention this to Jennifer. It will only upset her and serve no constructive purpose. Some things are better left alone." The second, from 2011. I've confirmed with my contact that the Swimmer family remains satisfied with the arrangement. The matter is closed. The third, from 2015. Do not bring this up with Jennifer. I've made it clear to you that this is resolved. There's nothing to be gained by reopening old wounds. But there was no record of any payment. No transfer of funds, no canceled checks, no wire confirmation. Nothing but Linda's absolute certainty that she had handled something she'd never actually handled. I looked at Michael. Your mother has been lying to you for 16 years, and you've been lying to me for 16 years. Based on a lie your mother told you. Based on nothing. I know, he whispered. You don't get to say that yet. You don't get to have your moment of contrition while I'm still trying to understand how fundamental the dishonesty is. You married me under false pretenses. You let me make decisions about my life, about my career, about our financial planning, all without knowing that my family had a 73-year-old debt hanging over it. What do you want me to do? The question was so inadequate, so perfectly capturing his belief that this was something that could be managed and resolved through the right combination of words and gestures, that something in me went very cold. I want you to call your mother. I want you to ask her what she did with the money. Because there had to be money, Michael. There had to be something. You don't lie this hard about nothing. He made the call right there in the kitchen. I listened to his voice go through its familiar rhythms of cajolery and pressure, the same voice he used with difficult clients and opposing counsel. Linda's responses came through as a distant squawk, indignant and cutting. She says she handled it, Michael said, covering the mouthpiece. That's not an answer. Ask her how much. Mom, how much did you pay the Swimmer family? The pause stretched. When Linda's voice came back, it was louder, more shrill. I could hear the words from 3 feet away. That is not your concern. That is not Jennifer's concern. That is a family matter that was handled appropriately, and I will not be interrogated like I'm some kind of criminal. Mom, there's a contract from 1947. It's come to light. We need to know what you did. I did what was necessary, Linda said, and there was something in her voice that made my blood go cold, not indignation, but fear. I did what needed to be done to protect this family, and if anyone is questioning that now, it's because someone who should have left well enough alone has decided to make trouble. Michael looked at me. I took the phone from his hands. Linda, this is Jennifer. I need to know what you did with that money. For a moment, there was nothing but breathing on the other end of the line. Then, you have no right to demand anything from me. I protected you, all of you. I kept this family from being destroyed by something that happened before you were even born. Did you pay the Swimmer family? I paid what needed to be paid, she said, and the words came out of her mouth like she was confessing to a crime she'd been keeping to herself for so long that admitting it had become almost a relief. I paid to make it go away. I paid so that you could have your perfect life without having to know about your family's mistakes. How much? $150,000. The number hung in the kitchen air like a physical thing. I did the calculation in my head, what that would have been worth in 2008, what it had cost her to buy her version of respectability, what price she'd put on my right to know the truth. And you told Michael it was handled, that the debt was satisfied. It was satisfied. I satisfied it. I paid them, and they agreed to sign an NDA, and the matter was closed. Do you have a copy of that agreement? The silence stretched longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller. I don't recall exactly where I filed it. It's been so long. The cold feeling spread. You don't have a copy. Jennifer, it doesn't matter. I handled it. They took the money and they agreed. I hung up the phone. Michael was staring at me with an expression of dawning horror. What does that mean? If she doesn't have the agreement, it means your mother might have paid off someone who wasn't actually representing the Swimmer family. It means she might have been scammed. It means there might not be any legitimate settlement at all. I called David Kersey from the kitchen, my voice steady even as my hands were shaking. He answered on the second ring. He'd apparently been expecting to hear from me. I need you to find the Swimmer family, I told him. The ones mentioned in that 1947 contract. I need to know if anyone from my family ever legitimately paid any debt related to that contract, and if so, when and how much. I can make some calls, he said carefully. Jennifer, are you all right? No, I said, but I will be. I hung up the phone and looked at Michael across the cooling garlic bread and the flickering candles. I'm going to sleep in Emma's room tonight. Tomorrow, I need you to gather every piece of financial information you have, every account, every investment, every piece of property we own together or separately. I'm hiring a divorce attorney. Jennifer, please. You made a choice, I said. Your mother made a choice, and now I'm making mine. The next 3 days were a blur of phone calls and documents. David Kersey's research turned up something that made everything worse and somehow also made it better, because at least now there was clarity. The Swimmer family had never received any settlement. Linda's payment, all $150,000, had gone to a man named Robert Caldwell, who had no legitimate connection to the Creek Nation Swimmer family, and who had apparently spent the money on a new boat and a vacation home in Branson, Missouri, before disappearing in 2009. Linda had been scammed, and then she'd lied to her son about it. And then her son had lied to me about it. And then she'd felt about her lie, claiming the matter was settled when it had never been settled at all, and the debt, a real, legitimate, century-old debt, had been sitting there in the darkness, compounding interest, waiting for someone to find it. Kersey called me on a Thursday afternoon with the news that the Swimmer family still existed, that they still had records of the original contract, and that they were very interested in discussing it. He'd also discovered that there had been a settlement attempt in 1998. My grandmother had apparently written a check to someone claiming to represent the family, but that check had never been cashed, and no receipt had ever been provided. It appears, Kersey said carefully, that your family has been the victim of an extended fraud, and that the legitimate debt has never been paid. The Swimmer family is amenable to negotiation, but they have an interesting position. They're willing to forgive a significant portion of the accumulated debt if you're willing to do something else. What? They want the boy who translated the document. They want to know who he is, and they want him to meet with them. I don't know why that detail hit me the way it did. Maybe because Marcus was the only person in this entire mess who had told the absolute truth, without qualification or hesitation. Maybe because he'd had nothing to gain and everything to lose by reading that document accurately, and he'd done it anyway. I spent the next week finding Marcus. The caseworker's office led me to his temporary placement, a group home in northeast Oklahoma City. He was there on a Saturday afternoon, sitting in the common room watching television with 3 other kids. When I asked if I could talk to him, he looked at me with wariness but also with a kind of recognition, like he knew that the person who'd been in the waiting room, the one who'd heard him translate, was going to come looking for him eventually. We sat in the office and I told him the whole thing. Not the parts I was ashamed of, I led with those. How my family had lied. How my husband had lied. How my mother-in-law had thrown money at a problem without solving it, then lied about solving it. How a document written in a language my family had deliberately forgotten had been sitting in my grandmother's files, waiting for someone who actually cared enough to read it truthfully. The Swimmer family wants to meet you, I told him. They want to understand how someone your age knows their language when most of their own family doesn't anymore. My grandmother taught me, Marcus said. He had a quiet way of speaking, like someone who'd learned early that people listened better when you didn't demand they do. Before she got sick, she said the language was dying and somebody needed to keep it alive, even if nobody thought it mattered. It mattered, I said. Your grandmother was right. It mattered. The meeting happened 2 weeks later, in Kersey's conference room. The Swimmer family sent 3 people, an elderly woman named Dorothy, who was the original contract signer's granddaughter, her son James, and James's daughter, who was about my age, and looked at me with the kind of exhaustion that comes from inheriting a grievance you didn't create. Marcus came with his caseworker, looking small in a chair that had been designed for adults. Dorothy looked at the 1947 contract for a long time, tracing her fingers over the script. My grandfather wrote this, she said. He was the only one in our family who could write it that well. He was so proud of this contract. It was supposed to secure our family's future. Instead, it became the thing that no one wanted to acknowledge. She looked at Marcus. Can you really read it? Yes, Marcus said simply. Will you teach my great-granddaughter? And that's how it started. Not with lawyers or settlements or the complex financial negotiations that Kersey eventually worked out. It started with Marcus sitting in Dorothy's living room on Sunday afternoons, and her great-granddaughter, a girl named Lily, who was 18 and had never learned her own language, slowly beginning to recognize the shapes of her heritage on the page. The settlement took 6 months to finalize. The Swimmer family agreed to forgive 80% of the accumulated debt. My family paid the remaining 20%, $137,000, which came out of the proceeds from selling the beach house in Destin and downsizing from the Colonial in Edmond. Linda fought it, of course. She said it was absurd, that it was revising history, that my grandmother should have handled it properly in the first place. But she didn't have a choice. The house was in Michael's name, and Michael had decided to do the right thing, maybe because he finally understood what his mother's version of protecting the family had cost. The divorce went through quietly in September. Michael kept the house in the city and the investment portfolio. I took the money from the settlement and the house sale and rented a small place in Bricktown, the neighborhood that was being restored by people who had the courage to invest in something broken. Emma cried about the divorce, but she and Jake adjusted better than I expected. Michael, to his credit, didn't try to weaponize them. He'd been too shaken by his own role in the lie to believe he had the moral authority to do that. But the real ending came 6 months later, in the spring. Marcus's caseworker found him a permanent placement with a family that understood what it meant to have a child who needed space to become himself. He started at the public high school instead of dropping out, and he joined the Native American Studies program through a grant that Dorothy helped him apply for. I saw him once, on the street downtown, and he was with Lily and an older woman who had to be Dorothy. He was laughing, actually laughing, not the careful smile of someone who'd learned to keep himself small. He waved at me, and I waved back. I never found out what happened to Linda. Michael said she stopped speaking to him after the settlement, that she'd moved to Arizona to live with an old friend, that she'd written him a letter saying she could never forgive him for betraying the family. I thought that was probably for the best. Some people need to be left alone with their version of the truth. The pearl necklace, the one my grandmother had given me for my 30th birthday, I gave to the Swimmer family. Dorothy cried when I put it in her hands. "She was a good woman," Dorothy said. "Your grandmother." I met her once, in 1975. She came to my house and she apologized. She said she was going to make it right. She said she just needed time to figure out how. "Why didn't she?" I asked. "Because time is a liar," Dorothy said. "It tells you that tomorrow will come, that you'll have another chance, that the hard thing will be easier later, and sometimes you run out of tomorrows before you ever become brave enough to do it." I thought about that a lot in the months that followed. I thought about my grandmother carrying that secret for 73 years, and my mother-in-law lying to protect something that didn't need protecting, and my husband choosing his mother's lie over my right to know. I thought about how the truth had come to me through a 15-year-old boy with worn sneakers and a caseworker, someone who had nothing to gain and everything to lose, but who'd read those pages anyway because someone had taught him that his language mattered. On a Tuesday morning in April, a year to the day after that first visit to Kersey's office, I woke up in my small apartment in Bricktown, and I made coffee in a mug that had belonged to my grandmother, one of the few things I'd kept. I sat on the fire escape with the spring air moving through my hair, and I watched the neighborhood come alive. A couple walked by holding hands, newly in love. A woman jogged past with a dog that was too big for its own good. Someone was playing music from an open window, something old and beautiful that I didn't recognize. The coffee was still hot, and it tasted like possibility instead of bitterness. I'd lost my marriage, my home, my place in a family that had been built on comfortable lies. I'd lost the illusion that the life I'd constructed was as solid as it had seemed. But I'd gained something else, the knowledge that truth, no matter how long buried, has a way of surfacing. And that sometimes the people who deliver that truth are the ones we least expect, the ones we've been trained to look through instead of at. My phone buzzed with a text from David Kersey. "Dorothy Swimmer wants to know if you'd consider joining the board of a new foundation, Creek Nation Language Preservation and Cultural Recovery. Interested?" I smiled and texted back, "Send me the details." I finished my coffee, And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't afraid of what came next.